Hello and welcome, this is Scott, and this week, basically our last week, we are going to be talking about externalities and market failures. So far this course we've talked about how wonderful things are and how things magically work out, but there's some situations where we don't get the socially optimal outcome, and we want to talk about what those are, because they may help us inform what our vision and what our role for government should be. So we need to talk about what externalities are, how they cause market failures. We need to talk about the difference between societal and private social costs and benefits. We want to talk about what public goods are and asymmetric information. Asymmetric information has two main categories of moral hazard and adverse selection, and we'll do some examples so you can visually see what this looks like and why it's a market failure. So first we need to talk about what a market failure is. A market failure is just simply when the market operating by itself does not produce the optimal amount of output. And by optimal, what we're talking about is where total surplus for society is maximized. We want to try and get to that optimal point, but for some reason we're not getting there. Well, why aren't we getting there? We want to talk about something called externalities. First, when I think about making a decision, I'm trying to decide how much will this decision benefit me and how much does it cost me? Should I make that decision or not? But sometimes my decisions have impacts on the people around me. So for example, if I choose to have the flu shot, I'm making that decision on the cost of a flu shot versus the benefit or expected benefit of getting the flu shot. However, the more people have the flu shots, the less likely the flu is to transmit, and that's better for you. So by me having the flu shot, that helps you out. But I'm not considering your benefit as I make my decision. That's an externality. An externality is anytime there's some benefit or cost to someone outside of the person who's buying or selling or where that transaction is happening. So externalities can be positive or negative. The case that I just talked about, a flu shot, the more people who have the flu shot, the better society's off. That's a positive externality. And there are all sorts of examples of positive externalities. There's education or pretty gardens or public parks. All these things have side effects that are wonderful, but there are also negative side effects. There's pollution is a really big one. When we don't factor these in, we're either going to have too much output, which will be bad, or have too little output, which is also bad. So let's talk about what that looks like. Up to this point, we have been talking about marginal cost versus marginal benefit. But now what we're going to do is we're going to throw in this extra letter here, this marginal private cost and marginal private benefit. And in a second, we'll talk about social cost and social benefit. So private cost and private benefit are just those incurred by the people who are buying and selling the good or service. So for the flu shot, I'm making my decision based on the private benefit that I expect to get from the flu shot. However, as we look from a planning perspective, society is best off when marginal social cost equals marginal social benefit, which is the sum of both the people in the transaction and everyone. We're starting off, this slide is just talking about looking at the private costs and benefits, and next slide will define social costs and benefits. So what we're going to do is we are going to add in, we're going to have social benefits being equal to private benefits and external benefits. So with the flu shot, this is my benefit of getting a flu shot, and this is your benefit if I get a flu shot. So from society, we care about both. But from a decision maker, I really only focus on mine. So we're going to talk about societal benefit and societal cost. Societal cost includes the private cost and the external costs. Just like we had before where we want to produce where marginal benefit equals marginal cost. Now what we're looking for is marginal societal benefit equals marginal societal cost. That will tell us the optimal output. So let's give an example of a negative externality and how it looks visually. So a negative externality is when I make a decision, I don't think about the external costs on other people. So for example, when I drive to work, I'm thinking about maybe the gas cost, the insurance cost, my time, but I'm not thinking about the pollution or maybe the noise that I cause for the people who live around me. When I go on a plane, I think about how much the plane ticket's going to cost and how long my flight's going to be and what's the benefit of going somewhere. But I don't think about the people who live under the flight pattern. I don't smoke, but people who smoke likely don't think about the people who are around them who don't smoke. We want to think about not just the private costs, but also the social costs. In all of these, whenever we're talking about a negative externality, something that negatively impacts the other people, the social costs have to be higher than the private costs. So let's show what that looks like. So in this example, this is the private costs, and now this is the social costs. The social costs are higher, right? Because they include the private costs and the external costs. When I make my decisions, I'm basing it on the private costs and the private benefits. So I am consuming Q1 is the market output, and the price is P1. However, if we thought about what's best for the society, it'd be where marginal social costs equal marginal social benefit. it would be E2. So we are overproducing from Q2 to Q1. We should just be producing Q2. And our costs are too low because we're not compensating those other people who are hurt. That is going to cause this yellow triangle, which is a deadweight loss. From society's point of view, think about this last Q1 that's consumed. Here's the social benefit, but here's the social cost. The cost is actually greater than the benefit. So we should not be consuming that. We should be consuming less. So this whole triangle here is a deadweight loss. One way we could get rid of that deadweight loss is if we imposed a tax that caused the price to go up by that difference. Now, of course, I'm going to talk in a little bit about, well, how would you measure that? And how would you know the price level that would exactly offset to cause a reduction in the socially optimal output? So from a theory point of view, it's possible. From an application point of view, it's really difficult. Just like there are negative externalities, there are positive externalities. The example I used at the beginning was flu shots. Education, having better educated people or healthier people will have a huge benefit in communication and everything else. If I plant a garden, I get some benefits from it, but so do my neighbors. So we have positive externalities throughout the economy as well. When I choose to plant a garden, I'm thinking about my private benefits, but society also benefits. There's external benefits. The demand curve is actually just lower than it should be. And because of that, we are underproducing because we're producing at E1 when we should be producing at E2. At that point, we want to subsidize or produce more. So again, positive externality has a problem that it's underproduced compared to what we would like. As I mentioned, there's all sorts of different ways we could correct for the externality. So there's persuasion and say, don't pollute. It's not good. It's bad. And put social pressures on. You could do taxes and subsidies. You could assign property rights. Say there's only so much pollution will allow, and then if you need to pollute more, you have to pay for it. So that way you're causing a price. You can have voluntary agreements where people decide and have treaties saying how much they're going to do. Regulations, all sorts of different stuff. The challenge for all this is measuring and figuring out what the optimal amount is. So specifically, if this is the social output and we put a tax on that brings us to this level, we are now going to produce only Q3. But what if the socially optimal amount was Q2? Now we just did a deadweight loss the other way because we are now underproducing rather than overproducing. So measuring that becomes a real challenge. Okay, next we're going to talk about the Coase theorem. So the Coase theorem was invented by a University of Chicago Nobel Prize winning economist who basically said that in the case of trivial or zero transaction costs, the property rights assignments do not matter to the resource allocative outcome, which basically means that if I am polluting and I assign the property rights to those people who are impacted, then I may have to pay them every time I pollute. Or if I own the property rights for pollution, then the other people who are negatively impacted by the pollution may pay me to stop driving. And either way, we could start to figure out what that cost is for transactions. I'll post a link, or you could find many links on YouTube for examples of Coase theorem. But it's just another way to think about how the solution to externalities can be resolved. Another challenging segment of market failures is called public goods. So we're going to talk about public goods and divide them into excludable and non-excludable, and rival versus non-rival. First, let's talk about rival and non-rival. Rival is if I eat an apple, by definition, you can't eat that apple. So that's rival. What one person consumes, other people can't. Non-rival is if I listen to the radio, you can listen to the radio too. My consumption does not diminish your consumption. So that's rival versus non-rival. Excludable versus non-excludable is I'm only going to let you on that plane if you pay. If you don't pay, you're not getting to be able to consume it. Non-excludable is the air or public defense or national defense. So if you don't pay your taxes, well, guess what? You are still getting the protection of the U.S. military because I can't exclude you from that. So we have to talk about excludable versus non-excludable and how that impacts something called the free rider problem. Think of a free rider problem of being Minnesota Public Radio or any public radio. There are lots of examples, but the idea here is that I am getting some private benefit from this. But do I need to pay for it is the real question. We know that if no one pays for it, the service isn't provided, but it's non-rival, right? So if the rest of the class pays for it, I still get the benefits without having to pay. So it may make sense for me not to pay for the product. The problem with that is, of course, if no one pays for it, the product isn't produced. It's another market failure. This is called the free rider problem. People who are jumping on the bus for free without paying for it. If too many people do that, the service doesn't get provided. This relates to another story called the tragedy of the commons, which I'll give you another link to because there's some fantastic videos out there that animate this very well. But you can think about farmers farmers or fishermen who are using a common pasture. So the cows are grazing and eating all the grass. Now, if I add another cow, I'm going to get the benefit of getting that food. But if everyone does that, the pasture is going to get overused. None of us would have an incentive to stop using that common good because we're getting the benefit without the cost. But if we all use that common good, we're going to overuse it and we're going to destroy that pasture. Maybe what we need to do is assign some property rights to it so that way there's an incentive for someone to take care of it. Another example of market failure is where we have asymmetric information. That's just where one party knows a lot more information than the other party. So for example, if I'm going to sell my car as a used car to you as the buyer, you don't know whether my car is high quality or if it's a lemon. So you know the average rate of a used car, let's pretend it's $10,000, and there are some cars that are superior to $10,000 and some cars that are all lemons. Well, everyone whose car is a lemon wants to sell their car for $10,000. So there's a problem there of how do we know, or how can I identify or sell to you a car and have you know that my car is actually good or bad? So that's a real problem. It creates moral hazard and adverse selection, which I'm going to define on the next slide. Adverse selection is the idea where you take advantage of information before a transaction. So for example, you might only buy health insurance if you need it, if you're not healthy. So if I offer health insurance, everyone who thinks they're going to spend that amount of money or more, it's advantageous for them to buy the insurance. That's going to attract the wrong people. Whereas moral hazard is something that now that you have life insurance, you may be more risky. You may be less likely to buckle your seatbelt or do other things because you're not as worried about it. Because you get into an accident, you have some sort of coverage. Or if you get into an accident, you only have to pay a deductible on your car. You won't lose your entire car. So that's moral hazard. So for most economists, you hear the term free market economist. And a free market economist really wants the market to work whenever it can. However, what this chapter really shows is that there may be a spot and a role for government. Well, what's the role for government? There are times when the free market does not produce the socially optimal output. And as a result, what we need to do is have government involvement to help correct that. Now, how they do it and how they measure it is not an easy task. But at least now we have a role for government as to where they should get involved, where they shouldn't. So some of the things we saw earlier where governments were getting involved, like minimum wage and rent control prices and price controls, were not the right places, the most economists would say, for government to get involved, because that distorts the economy and creates a dead weight loss. Here, what we're saying is we want the government to be involved to eliminate dead weight loss, to increase total society. And that's a totally different outcome. And if that interests you, there are whole branches of economics and public policy dedicated to what the role of government should be.